lot I want to say, and of course it's late in the afternoon, you're tired, you've been listening to important stuff all day, so that's of course why we scheduled a really heady session right now, when you're the least receptive, but I'll try to make it digestible. So who am I and why should you trust anything I say when I have a hairstyle that's not compatible with any VR headsets? Good question. I've been doing interactive digital stuff for about 20 years, web apps, games, stuff like that. VR for about 4. I'm global director of VR for a company called MediaMonks. It's the world's largest digital production company. We have 10 offices around the world. The only place where I pay rent is in New York, but I mostly see the insides of airplanes and conference rooms. And we'll get to some insides of airplanes later on with Etihad Airways. And so we're going to talk about how to hack the human perception with finesse, but there's a bit more to that. So one thing we've heard a lot of sessions here that go into a lot of technical topics. However, VR is about more than the technology by a long shot, and I think that we all quite easily skip over that and miss that sometimes. So we're going to start with some background before we get into VR properly. And these are petroglyphs, or rock carvings. They're about 5,000 to 6,000 years old. It's from very, very close to where I grew up in the north of Sweden. And these people that made these carvings, they lived off of hunting moose. They hunted, ate moose. They made clothes out of moose hides. So they carved depictions of hunting moose into these rocks. And anyone who came upon these carvings, then or now, are very unlikely to go, oh shit, that's a real moose. Of course, everyone understands that it's just a depiction of moose. It's only there to put the idea of moose hunting in your head. They understood it, we understand it. And that's a pretty neat trick. Some squiggly lines, and you can yeah, that's probably a moose, maybe, or a child drew it. But it is a neat trick that we can do that. We can put the idea of an event into someone's head who we've never met in 5,000 years from now with some lines. And over time, our ways of putting ideas into people's heads have become neater tricks. And as technology and language has evolved, so has our ability to do so. But today, 5,000 or 6,000 years later, that's still what most mediums do. They put ideas of stories into our heads. This kid gets the story of the dragon and the castle and whatever else from the book, but he paints it out in his head. There's an interpretation and translation of the book into his mental visuals. So the Stone Age people that did the rock carvings, they didn't even have an alphabet. And now we have weird-looking words like verisimilitude, and I'm going to get back to this particular one. We also have very technological mediums, of course, like games and films. And even though they're way more concrete than the rock carvings or the book, they show you rather than tell you, they still involve the interpretation and translation of the medium into your head. Because what's happening in the film is not happening to you. And even though she inhabits a character from a first-person perspective in the game that swings a sword at a dragon, it is not her hand doing it. It's not her truly doing it. She's doing it by proxy. There's an abstraction layer. And we try to leap over that abstraction layer in our interpretation and translation of everything we see and hear and do in these mediums. TV and film, in turn, tries to reach out of the screen to us. Not quite like the Ringu girl does here. Even 3D glasses can't do this. But I just use it as a metaphor of the conventions of the medium trying to bridge the gap between us and the chair or a sofa on one side of the room and the rectangle on the wall on the other side of the room. So there's all these conventions that have come to be from the Lumiere brothers filming workers leaving a factory in 1895 or so, where they put a camera towards the factory when the workers were leaving. That's it. It's very matter-of-factly. And we've learned over time, over these 120 years since, that we can convey emotions and ideas and narrative structures much better if we're not so matter-of-factly. So no one goes to the bathroom in movies, no one says hello when they hang up, cars explode way more easily, and if someone went up to you and acted like a person acts in a film, even though we accept their behavior and can get really emotionally involved with it in film or TV, they would be really weird to you in real life, because that's not how anyone acts. There's an abstraction to it, there's a tweak to it that is a part of the narrative structure of the language. So, I know what you're thinking. We're going to get to VR. That's why we're here. So I'm not saying that VR has to be all about realism, that we can't do these conventions, that we can't skip things or we can't exaggerate things. But crucially, and this is my point in all of this, is that VR holds the potential of taking out the interpretation and translation of the medium. It is the first medium that I would argue can be a direct sensory experience. And that is sort of the potential and promise of VR. So you are flying the spaceship, you're not watching someone do it, you're not doing it via proxy of keyboard and mouse or a game controller. But I say it can be a direct sensory experience because in a lot of ways I think we're not quite there yet. We don't have, actually ask yourselves, do you have something that you just long to get home to get back into? Like, I have to get home to do that thing in VR again, day after day. No? That tells us that VR hasn't reached its potential, right? We all think that that's there somewhere in our future, towards the horizon somewhere, but we're not there yet. So why aren't we there yet? In terms of what we do and how we treat the medium, I have a theory of why. So Abraham Maslow was one of several people to coin a phrase something like this in the 60s, like if all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. And it's very poignant because we as humans are pattern recognition machines. We watch we interpret everything new in light of what we already know. If you're a filmmaker, VR starts out as just another screen. If you're a game producer, VR starts out as being just another peripheral. Because that's what you know, that's your starting point. And when you're trying to see whether VR has reached its potential right now, you're looking at most people's first attempts at producing VR content. And you're looking at VR's equivalent of workers leaving the factory in 1895. And film didn't flourish when we figured out what was the best theater play to film. Film flourished when it came into its own and was its own thing. VR will have the same trajectory. VR will not be at its peak or reach its full potential when we figure out what experience to film in 360. That's not what it is. Just change the camera to a 360 camera. So I think if you treat VR as just another screen, you're injecting a glass ceiling of potential that you can't go beyond because you're making VR as a medium be an interpreted medium, one that you have to translate the story into your head when it doesn't have to be. So if you as a filmmaker go into VR thinking you're going to make film but in a different screen with a different camera, I think you're using Maslow's hammer to put a square peg in a round hole, or a 16-9 peg in a spherical hole, if you will. And that's not how you're going to get this to reach its full potential. So great VR starts not with a technical solution, it starts with an idea that's VR native, that's VR from the ground up. And what would that be? Why would something be VR native? Well, what does VR do? It allows you to be in a space and time you couldn't otherwise be in. Uniquely as a medium, we can actually be present elsewhere in physical space and in time. If you don't need that in your idea, if you have a creative idea for something for VR and you don't need the user to feel like they're elsewhere, that's irrelevant to the experience, maybe you should use a rectangle. Because VR takes away certain tools. And again, I keep referencing film, and I'll get to more like interactive live rendered or real-time rendered stuff. But VR for a filmmaker takes away editing, takes away framing, or radically changes editing and doesn't take it away. And it puts very different demands on how you do something on set, puts very different demands on post-production, on audio, on planning, on everything. So it's just much harder. And if it doesn't need to be, if you don't need to be present inside of it, if it's a story better told in rectangles, which we've perfected really well, then maybe that's what you should do. But if you have something that utilizes the strengths of the medium and actually potentially even utilizes some of the drawbacks we have right now, you can get a very significant effect from that. So one thing we have so far, before light fields hit it off properly, if they ever will, or volumetric film in some sense, is that in a film-based VR experience, you can't move the camera after the fact. The camera is where the camera was. I can look around from this point in space where the camera was, but I can't take that step and see the perspective shift accordingly. We did a piece together with Etihad McCann in Stockholm about bullying. And if you're bullied in a classroom, you can't really do anything. Like, it's a very helpless situation where this current limitation of VR capture technology sort of worked to our advantage, because you sit there and you just have to endure, which is the reality of kids that are being bullied. So also in another medium, very few people watch a film and you see the monster sneaking up on someone. You're not going to yell out to your screen, look behind you. But this guy, he stood up and started talking back to the bullies as just a natural reaction. The reason we filmed him in the first place is that he's one of the sort of anti-bullying ambassadors working with this educational TV channel. And this was to get their sort of take on the campaign. So we filmed them sitting through the experience in the same classroom where it was shot. So they were going to watch it, and then we're going to talk to them about their experience. We almost couldn't do any of that because that's not the reactions we got. He started yelling at people in VR, even though he perfectly well knew that he couldn't, but that's just his natural reaction. And you've all been on a high ledge in VR. If you haven't, you should. And you know that there's floor here, but you can't get your legs to do that movement because you go, no, fuck off. That's not happening. Like, your nervous system, your just instinct for survival makes you not do it. And his instinct for survival was to defend himself against this threat. And so all the other people, 4 or 5 out of 9 started crying. They took off the headset after 3 minutes with tears streaming down because it was so awful. And it's not just awful in this case then because you had to endure some harsh treatment. It's awful because of the realization of what it's like to be there, what it's like to be helpless. And I don't think another medium will elicit this response in 3 minutes. I challenge you to think of a medium that would do that statistically. So if you're willing to break free from the shackles of mediums past, this is the type of intensity of reaction that VR can provide. This is hinting at the potential of the medium. It doesn't have to be tear-jerking. We've seen a lot of this, and oh yeah, you're in a refugee camp in Jordan, or you're watching misery in a orphanage in South Africa, and whatever it might be. And they're very valid use cases, but that's not all that VR can be. VR can reach you emotionally at this depth on any part of the emotional spectrum. And that's the power of the medium. But if that's what you're aiming for, and if you agree with me, you're free not to, but if you agree with me that the purpose of VR is to go beyond what we could do with other mediums, if the reason for existence of VR is that it has a potential to do something differently, to do something more, then that raises the bar for what we need to do to achieve that. So Truman, from the film Truman Show here, he set sail to what he thought was the real horizon. But he's not going to believe that sky again. If I can make a pun, I'll say that ship has sailed. Thank you for one chuckle. So it is not called virtual make-believe, it's called virtual reality. And if that's what we're aiming for, that really sets the bar high. If there was a stitch line across my face right now, or a black gaping hole beneath you, or everything was like under a strobe light because the frame rate was off in the game engine, or whatever it might be, you'd have a really hard time following what I'm trying to say if that happened to you in real life. If that happened and you watched it in a rectangle, you'd be like, yeah, there's some jitter in there, but it wouldn't bother you that much. So the consequence of error of technical execution is also much greater in VR. Because all of the flaws, all of the unrealistic pictures, or like if you try to represent a real human being in a game engine, they're going to look really uncanny, and the uncanny valley is extremely deep in VR. Or you have these artifacts in film-based VR, or you have those frame drops, or you lose the tracking, or you invoke the chaperone in a Vive experience. They all go, you're in VR. They just remind you. Ultimately, we don't want those reminders. So craftsmanship in VR is way more important, I would argue, than in any preceding medium, because of what we're aiming for, because that thing we're aiming for is something greater than make-believe, something greater than interpreting what's in a rectangle, imagining ourselves into the rectangle. So back to this word that the Swedish moose hunters didn't have. I'm not saying that all of VR needs to be absolutely photorealistic and fully believable in that sense to work, but it needs to have internal truth. It needs to be internally consistent within its world for a believable, coherent experience. There are some really, really great VR experiences that have stylized computer graphics that are meant to run on mobile and pull that off really well. But they have the overall appearance of being true. So I've been doing VR for about 4 years. And like, this list should probably be updated weekly, because I keep finding new things that are extremely important to get right. And so when I say VR is the most multidisciplinary medium there is, I'm not kidding. Like, all of this, not maybe in every experience, but overall, like, this is just a small fraction of stuff that you need to rethink or figure out from scratch and ultimately master if you want to make VR believable, if you want to remove the glass ceiling of immersion, if you want to reach that potential of going from make-believe to a direct sensory experience. And so the conclusion is obviously that everything matters in all of this. That makes VR very hard. And I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm trying to say that there's a reward in caring about all these details. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. A couple of years ago, together with MPC, we produced an auto show installation for Chrysler. Chrysler built an entirely new factory, fully robotic, as you would with a factory nowadays, and really state-of-the-art, the precision and everything, that builds what is ultimately a normal car. So it's not going to draw attention on a showroom floor. The flashy stuff is what people are going to flock around. But how do you show the factory and how amazing that is? Well, you take them to the factory from the perspective of the car.
The sea before.
And of course, it explodes.
Wow. The car flies apart.
So
the doors fly away, the hood
this
flies
was,
away.
again, about 2 years ago.
Actually a little over 2 years ago we produced this.
That's why it's using the DK2 headsets. There wasn't anything else out at the time.
So you get inside
and it combines Unreal Engine
from a 3D
with
standpoint, you can
filmed
actually look
pieces.
around what we do,
And it's
how we
actually
do it, the precision that
particle
we make
effects in Unreal
this car
Engine
with,
over the video
and
pieces.
the amount of robotics that goes on.
And we learned a lot of things here. So the reason I show this is that it is an example of everything matters. When we built this, we had a Chrysler 200 to test the install in, because the point was to map the virtual car exactly to the real car. So when you reach for the steering wheel, it would be where you saw it should be. And if someone adjusted the seat and took it back or something, that precision was off. They would reach for the steering wheel or hit it too soon or something like that. And when that happened, it was an instant reminder, an instant deal breaker for immersion. But when it was working, when it was where it should be, holy shit, people were just amazed. And we had another thing. So the reason that guy says, wow, when it explodes is also because we massage his butt when that happens. There's a vibration servo in the seat. So it's just a little bit of pleasure in there. But when that vibration wasn't timed to the visuals or the audio, it also was a distraction rather than elevating the experience. And fine-tuning that and testing and making sure it could never drift off, that it was always spot on, took it from confusing to fantastic. And we also worked extremely hard on maintaining the frame rate in this. So Oculus DK2 ran at 75 frames per second. Every single other VR auto show thing that we saw at the LA Auto Show in 2014 when we launched this had frame drops. And if you've experienced frame drops in VR, especially as you're moving your head, it's extremely uncomfortable. Like if you're looking at a monitor and goes from 75 to 68 and back up to 75, you're not even going to notice. But in VR, you go, ugh, what? Like it's like you have a mini stroke. It is really bad. So we really, really cared about that too. And hadn't we cared about that, none of the other stuff would have mattered. And so speaking of that, this 2014, we had a bunch of people trying this. You know, at an auto show, you get all walks of life. We had people walking up that didn't even have an email address. And now they're going to understand how to navigate a VR experience. There weren't even many examples of existing navigation or UI tools in VR experiences when we built this. There wasn't that much that had ever been done. So we try to like figure this out. So this little thing, when you select what you want to see, this is slightly sped up just for example. The size of this, the color of it, how it animates, how the animation accelerates and decelerates, how it closely to this label that it triggers. Did I say color? Because color. Its sound and everything. We did over 200 iterations and combinations of this. And it was really hard to find 200 people to try it because we got blind to it. We had no idea what we were doing towards the end. We thought everything was awesome or everything was shitty. But the reason I point this out is those 70-plus-year-olds with no email address, they managed to get through this, almost every one of them. And I'm really proud of that, actually, because if they hadn't, none of the care we took and everything else would matter, because they wouldn't get anywhere inside of this. So we got them over that hurdle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about music. Music in film and movies, even though it is non-diegetic, and non-diegetic means that it doesn't belong in the picture. Diegetic audio is something you see that happens in the scene. Non-diegetic is a voiceover or music or something like that. So we still accept it as belonging in the film, even though it obviously doesn't belong in the film from like an objective standpoint, because that's a convention of the medium and it's just part of the language of cinema. And we accept that music is there as an emotional guide going, this is what you should probably feel right now. But in VR, you are really there. And suddenly there's like a violin and you're like, what? It's distracting in a very different way. I don't know if you've seen that, but if you look at VR experiences, or heard that, or felt that, if you look at VR experiences with a very significant sort of soundtrack, some documentary pieces have that, for example. Think about how you react to film music in that context relative to film. To me, it feels like it tugs on my emotional strings a little too hard. It's a little bit too obvious in VR. And it kind of feels like this scene from Blazing Saddles, when it just takes you out of what you were looking at. Because you kind of expect that to be there somewhere. But there is this power of music in terms of emotional impact. It's a really important tool in all of filmmaking, in all of television, in all of our lives. I think music, the fact that we can listen to music and like, it's just frequencies that arbitrarily can move us to tears or make us feel like we can conquer the world or whatever else, that's pretty fantastic. It's like a hotline to our emotions through one of our senses. So why don't we use that in VR then? Well, you can use it, but you got to be a bit careful. You've got to tune that a little bit. And something we did for this project, a film-based thing for Etihad Airways. And like any good VR experience, it has Nicole Kidman and a live falcon. We wanted to convey a sense of luxury because this is the most luxurious commercial airplane in the world. Their incarnation of the Airbus A380. The top seat here from Abu Dhabi to New York costs over $25,000. You get your own butler. It's a 3-room apartment with your own shower. Falcon not included. Nicole is also extra. I actually asked them, who the hell upgrades? Who upgrades to spend $25,000 on a one-way ticket? And they're like, no, 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 no. No one upgrades. They downgrade from private jet when they want to be a bit modest. Makes sense. And so we wanted to convey that luxury, that sort of level of finesse that this really has. But an airplane sound is really not very sexy. Can you guys turn up the audio a little bit for this next one? Because it's been a bit quiet. So this is my reference recording from the real plane. Does it convey luxury to you guys? Finesse? No, it doesn't. And we didn't want to use music, so what do? Well, we decided to, actually, if anyone here is going to the AES, Virtual Reality Audio Convention in Los Angeles on Friday? No one? Anyway, I'm presenting a white paper on the audio design for this project. Anyway, so what we did is use a modular analog synthesizer to generate a type of noise from which we could elevate frequencies with an equalizer to form a chord. So we took a type of noise, took some frequencies, because noise is all frequencies, and then we took some frequencies up a little bit to get some sort of harmonic bed to have everything play out on top of. That, of course, doesn't sound at all like an airplane. It sounds like this. And so how, if you saw this in a TV or film, you'd go, what's the weird sound the plane is making? Is this a spaceship? But we had another trick that we could pull here that you couldn't pull normally, because we could spatially place the sound outside of the airplane, because that's where an airplane sound is coming from. It's coming from turbulence on the outside of the fuselage, from the engines, from the wings. And when we place it there, so it's spatially larger than the space you see, and as you move your head, it behaves like the sound of a real plane. You just go, yeah, that's a plane. And it just works. No one has questioned it so far, which is pretty amazing. So VR has these tricks. And so the title of this is Hacking the Senses, and one of the things we really wanted to do is push what we could do in all different aspects of production. If we'd just gone, oh, music kind of doesn't work, let's just skip music and call it a day there, this would have been a lesser experience. But caring about craftsmanship got us to this point. And I get that that's a cue that I've been going a bit long. Yeah. Anyway. This is actually launched, so 2 days ago, Facebook launched the support for higher order ambisonics plus non-diegetic, non-spatialized audio in the same mix on their platforms. This was the premiere piece that was on, so this was the first one to get the support on all of Facebook and Oculus, I'm pretty proud to say. So you can listen to it there. Anyway, the 2 conclusions. You've heard about the chain and the weakest link. Well, VR is a super long chain, and if you don't get all of these things right, then one link of your chain is going to be a zip tie, and you're not going to get to that level of immersion that you could otherwise achieve. So VR can remove interpretation. It can be a direct sensory experience. It works its magic when we create internally consistent, believable worlds. And the puzzle has more pieces, but the reward is a bigger picture. And that bigger picture is worth striving for. And this sort of summarizes that. It's worth being ambitious with all of these pieces, because that's how we move the medium forward. Thank you. I'll grab one of these.
Yeah. Well, you know, you got my sympathy when you said maybe everybody's already really tired, so I gave you a couple of more minutes.
Thank you very much.
So, but do we have questions? Okay,
yep.
There in the back, please. We are not allowed to bring too many questions, but let's have that
Yeah,
one.
first of all, I love what you did with the sound. We working on those concepts to integrate such modulated noises to real-life architecture. So I love that it comes to the virtual world now. And my question about is what the client has to say. For us, it's very difficult to sell those sounds and to tell the client, okay, you have to have this. This brings an emotional level to every application you want to do. And so, yeah, that's the basic question, what you did to sell this.
Yeah, and there's a lot we had to do to sell this production as a whole, because it's one of the most ambitious real-time virtual reality pieces ever done. If anyone's going to Oculus Connect 3, I'll also be on a panel there and talk about filming for VR. But so what we did was basically try to win their confidence that we know how to do this. They had never done VR, we have. Please listen to our arguments and trust that they're coming from an interest of making this the best that it can be. And in this particular case, a lot of people, or several people on the end client side at Etihad have previously worked at Electronic Arts and DICE. So they're coming from the gaming world and are fairly technical and understood a lot of these things better than most clients would.
Yeah, it's a wonderful project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. When there are more questions, you are here, I guess, hopefully
Yes.
with us. But I wanted to thank you, especially from my side, because you said a lot of things that I always say, and people tend to not listen too much to me because I'm coming from Fraunhofer, and they always say, yeah, you have the money, and you set the benchmarks, and you're always talking about this high resolution and things like that, and saying, please make sure that craftsmanship is really important. And
yeah, you're building a substitute for reality. You're not building make-believe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yep. So when are you talking in LA?
So on Friday, I am at AES.
Like tomorrow?
LA? No, next Friday, thankfully.
Oh, okay.
And then at Oculus Connect on the Thursday, October 6th, I'm on a panel as well, and we'll be bringing up some Etihad stuff.
Oh, maybe then you can come to Los Angeles on the 13th and 14th when we talk about VR on the lot.
I'll be at VR on the lot.
Oh, then
Yeah.
I see you there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I only see the insides of airplanes.
Maybe we'll see us in the airplane. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh,